Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1, action.
Assume nothing.
Brash, bald-faced blasphemy.
Question everything.
I find it extremely hard to imagine.
Open your eyes.
It is quite all right to be an atheist.
The fastest growing group of people in the country has been measured as being those who have no belief or who are atheists.
You don't have to be apologetic or quiet about it.
Challenge the opposition.
You see religion on 100 fronts losing the argument.
And start thinking. This is The Thinking Atheist Worldwide.
Our broadcast today is brought to you by my friends at Nature Box. Great tasting and wholesome snacks that are delivered right to your door. And if you're desperate for a Christmas gift, you can give Nature Box as a gift to somebody else. Check it out. And check out your free Nature Box sampler box. If you've never tried them, go to naturebox.com/thinkingatheist. naturebox.com/thinkingatheist. It is the 16th of December, 2014. We're 9 days away from the Christmas holiday. It's always interesting to see the different reactions and perspectives on Christmas. Some people are like me, and they really enjoy the holiday. They enjoy the Christmas tree, and they enjoy, the Christmas music and the stockings over the fireplace and watching the kids open gifts, that kind of thing. I don't like shopping for a lot of people. My Christmas list is very, very, very small. I've seen some people just imprisoned by these obligations they put in front of themselves every single December. Oh, I've got to buy something for all the kids, all the grandkids, all the nephews, all the nieces. It just sucks the joy out of it. Becomes this sort of list of chores you have to accomplish before the 25th. It's high stress. It's not what the holiday should be about anyway. The holiday should be about a spirit of giving and all that stuff. Some people are completely cynical, and I understand that as well, especially when you see the commercialization of the holiday and the people trampling each other at 4 o'clock in the morning when the retailers open their doors. Some people are ambivalent. They don't care one way or the other. Some people just hate Christmas. They just hate Christmas. They refuse to say the word Christmas. It's just fascinating to watch all of these different perspectives on the holiday. Regardless, make the day what you want it for you and yours, and I hope it's a fantastic day for you and yours. I have gotten some pretty good input back on the Christmas Behind the Curtain video that I posted a few weeks back, which explores the largely pagan origins of Christmas. I'll go ahead and link that in the description box of this podcast in case you haven't seen it and are interested. Something very interesting on Facebook. Only reason I know about this is because I was tagged, but a gentleman posted my video and said, hey, everybody, check this out. An interesting look at the origins of Christmas. And I'm guessing he did this for the benefit of Christian relatives or friends. And immediately there was a response by a woman who said something like not interested or don't like. And he said, did you watch the video? And she said, why should I? You're an atheist. Which is a hugely telling scenario. He posted something and she immediately said, I dislike, I disagree, without actually knowing what the content of the video was that she disagreed with. And then right after that, in all caps, was a declaration of her faith and love in Jesus Christ. I mean, it was just an amazing sort of an example of the doubling down on religious belief that people sort of do when their precious belief system is challenged in some way, or they feel it's challenged. Had she watched the video, she would have seen a declaration by me that, hey, I support an individual's right to hold a personal conviction or belief. I may disagree with it. I might even find it loathsome, but you have a right to have that belief, a private belief, right? It's not promoted by a government. You're not infecting science books. You're not indoctrinating children. But if you want to believe something personally, okay, knock yourself out. She would have actually seen a very accessible and sort of pleasantly argued exploration of the Christmas season. Anyway, I thought that was really interesting. And it's probably not the first time it's happened. I'm sure there are probably many instances that have happened well off my radar. We're going to talk about Jesus, since Jesus is supposedly the reason for the season. Next Tuesday's podcast will feature kind of an all-star panel of experts on Jesus. Dr. Richard Carrier, author of the new book on the historicity of Jesus. Also joining us will be David Fitzgerald, author of the book Nailed, 10 Christian Myths That Show Jesus Never Existed at All. And Dr. Robert M. Price, who's written many books, including The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man. They will all join us. They are all experts on Jesus, on the Jesus story, and the history of Christ. We're going to talk about that next Tuesday on the radio, so I hope you can join us for that show. Today's show is called What You Don't Know About Religion But Should. It is named for the new book by Dr. Ryan Cragun, who is my special guest for the broadcast, and we'll talk to him in about 60 seconds. But first, I do want to say thanks out to NatureBox for sponsoring the broadcast. It's nice to see entities like NatureBox supporting free thought programming and providing good stuff to our audience. I'm actually getting a lot of great feedback from the folks in this audience who are trying out NatureBox, and they like what they see. They often tag me on social media whenever they get their boxes and say, hey, this stuff is really, really good. It's a great chance to drop the sugar, drop the fat, drop the vending machine out of your snack routine and try something new, something better. It's NatureBox with hundreds of delicious snacks, 0 artificial flavors, colors, or sweeteners, 0 grams trans fats, no high fructose corn syrup. You'll find options with no added sugar, without gluten ingredients, and a whole lot more. Log on and browse a host of options like Kung Pao pretzels, salted caramel pretzel pops, coffee kettle popcorn, zesty noodle crunch, and a whole lot more. And if you've never tried them before, you have a chance to check out NatureBox for free with a trial box that features 5 of their most popular snacks. That's free snacks. So to start your free trial, go to naturebox.com/thinking Atheist. Stay full, stay strong, and snack smarter with NatureBox. naturebox.com/thinking Atheist. Dr. Ryan Cragun is an Associate Professor of Sociology. He is a sociologist of religion, and he's author of the new book called What You Don't Know About Religion But Should. And he joins me on the radio today. Dr. Cragun, great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
I'm at a bit of a loss here. Do I call you Doctor?
No.
Do I call you Ryan? Do I call you Your Excellency?
Ryan is great. Only my students have to call me Doctor.
I had somebody tell me, and this may be just a projection of the atheist onto the religious, but I have been told, and I think I may have noticed in my own circles, that there are those, especially in religion, who are sort of playing the credibility card, who will insist on being called by the title first. I'm a doctor. I have a doctorate. I'm a PhD. And they just plaster that stuff all over the place in an attempt to say, look at me. Look at how accomplished and educated and advanced I am. And then I meet other people like, Donald Prothero, who's this amazingly brilliant paleontologist. And he's like, call me Donald.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, and the only reason I have my students do it is so they realize that there's a difference between us, right?
Yeah.
Because, when we're talking, and I play soccer with my students sometimes too. Out on the soccer field, I'm still Ryan, right?
Yeah.
It's in a classroom setting, just so they know that I'm giving them their grade at the end of the day. Other than that, no, I'm Ryan. Doctor is way too formal for me.
Talk to me about your background real fast for those who are still becoming introduced to you and your work. You come out of religion, or are you a lifetime infidel? What's your story?
I grew up in Utah, and of course the next question is, was I Mormon? Absolutely. Yeah. I was raised Mormon, a very devout Mormon family. My dad was a bishop. My grandfather was a stake president, for those who know the lingo. So I was raised in Utah, stayed a member. I was a Mormon missionary in Costa Rica from 96 to 98, and continued in the religion all the way up until the summer of 2002, which was after my first year in graduate school, and graduate school was pretty instrumental in leading me out of religion. So it was 2002 when I gave religion the boot, and haven't looked back. Couple months after leaving Mormonism, I realized I was an atheist. I'm done. Doesn't work for me. None of
I can see you on the mission. Man, I can see you in the slacks and the white shirt, and you're out there I don't even know much about what happens in a mission. Can you explain to me what happens in this? Is it 2 years that you depart your family or what?
Yeah, so you don't get to pick where you go. If you've got some language training, then that might influence it. But you basically just submit a packet saying, I'm willing to go. And then they kind of give insinuate that it's inspiration and revelation that are deciding where you're going. Turns out it's just where they need missionaries. But and then there are other factors. If you've got health issues, they might keep you in the U.S., whatever. But they just kind of assign you a place, and then you head out. And while you're there, I mean, I can go into a lot of detail, but I'll keep it short. Your schedule every day, you're up at like 6 or 6:30 in the morning. You spend a couple of hours getting ready, studying, preparing to go out, and then usually around 9 or 9:30, you're out the door, and you're trying to find people to convert to the religion until about 9 o'clock at night, stopping for lunch and dinner at different places, and you're with a companion 24/7. The only time that you're not with your companion is when you're in the bathroom. It wasn't in my mission, but a good buddy of mine, in his mission, they even had to keep the bathroom door cracked open because the mission president was worried that they were going to be masturbating. So a good way to keep them from not masturbating, right? Is keep that bathroom door cracked open. So
I saw the Mormon, what was that video called? Something about the battlefield, where it was all about keeping your friends from self-pleasuring. And the metaphor was somebody out there who was right there in the mix of battle. And we, as his fellow soldiers, must go and help him off the battlefield or something like that,
Yeah, it was a rather homoerotic video, which I thought was great.
It was, he's taking up arms, the whole phallic thing with the rifle.
Oh, yeah, it was great. I mean, it was completely backfired for what they were trying to do, but hey, that's fine. But yeah, so
was it like boot? I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ryan. Go ahead.
Oh, no. It is kind of like boot camp. You actually start out with depending if you're learning a language, then it's 2 months of training. If you're not, then you're in there for 4 weeks, 6 weeks. God, it's been forever since I've done this. Maybe even 3 weeks. But I did that training in Provo, and then I went to Costa Rica, so I picked up Spanish. I don't even mean this like jokingly or kind of to be mean to religion, but it really was like the worst 2 years of my life. It's brutal. It's hard. You've got really strict rules. You can't watch TV. You can't read any books except a very limited selection of books that they assign to you. You can't touch anybody of the opposite sex except maybe to shake their hand. No hugs or anything like that. You can't call home. You can call home twice a year on Mother's Day and Christmas to talk to your parents. Otherwise, you can write. Now they have email that you can send, and it's all done through the church's email system. So there's always the question of whether they're censoring your email. I mean, I like to call it a total institution. It's kind of like military boot camp. They take your name away, so you lose your first name. All the men become elder, all the women become sister, and then it's just you've got your last name. Everybody dresses the same. Everybody has to act exactly the same. It's a complete breakdown of identity to try and reform you into somebody else. It's a really rough time.
Yeah, it all sounds very Jim Jones. It's like you are sort of cordoned off. They build the barbed wire fence around you. And I didn't realize that they'd stripped you of your name. So now we're talking about your identity becomes what? The church or Jesus?
Yeah. Oh, well, very much part of the church, right? So you become a representative of the church, and that's how you identify yourself. So as you knock on doors, you'll say, hi, we're representatives of the church. Sure, you could say I'm Elder Cragun or whatever, right? But you don't use your first name. You don't get to know first names. Most of my companions, because you have an assigned companion, I occasionally would find out their first names. But basically for the months that I lived with these people, I just called them by elder and whatever their last name was. Like it's that de-identified that you can literally just slot people into those places. There's no real personable nature to it. Now they've tried to change that a little bit, and they're recognizing that the door-to-door approach is just miserable and it doesn't work very well. It's the least effective way. So they're trying to get onto online stuff using Facebook and Twitter and different things like that. But
well, I don't want to make this like the Mormon show because we're not talking about Mormonism, but I'm fascinated. I've got, a personal experience right here. I've got to ask one more question along this thread. Do the people who knock on the doors hate knocking on the doors as much as people hate receiving the knock? Do you dread going on to the next porch?
It's a mix. So I hated it. I absolutely despised that because it's like cold calling people or, selling. So what we would do, we'd come up with games. Like you have to inject the word hot dog in your next door. Yeah, you'd have to do it because it's just so tedious. And you know that 99% of these doors are going to be like, we're not interested. They're not going to answer. I could tell you stories beyond stories of crazy things we did. Just
come on. What's the worst thing that ever happened to you? What's the worst thing that was said to you by somebody?
Not said to me, something that I said.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it's kind of bad. We were, this is my second area, my third companion, I think. We were knocking on doors and we were playing one of those games, right? Where it's like, okay, you got to do this, you've got to say something. And he had this door approach where he would say, "Hi, my name is Chupacabra," which I don't know if you're familiar with the Chupacabra.
Oh, yeah.
It's a Latin American thing, right? So it's the bloodsucker. So he would say, "Hi, I'm the Chupacabra, and my companion is such and such, some monster, and we're here to give you a message." It was supposed to kind of like break the ice, like, oh, we're not these really uptight, stiff Mormons. And for some reason at this one particular door, as he did it, like he didn't tell me ahead of time that he was going to do it. He'd done it before and I knew it, but he started doing it. And when he turned to me and introduced me as a monster, I roared at the woman who had answered the door. Like I was like, "Roar!" I have no idea why I did it. And it totally freaked her out. She didn't know what to think and slammed the door on us, right? And I still feel bad about it. Like, okay, maybe I saved her from becoming a Mormon or something, but at the same time, it was just like the totally most inappropriate thing that I ever did on my mission.
Elder Cragun, I mean, really, what would Jesus have done in that situation? It's just sad. It's just sad.
Yeah.
You've got a lot of both written and spoken works out there. You talk a lot about religion. Your new book is called What You Don't Know About Religion But Should. And I want to wrap most of the show around this whole thing. What we don't know about religion but should. You're talking mostly Christianity? Do you pinball around the major religions? What's the story?
Mostly Christianity, but I do pinball around. So, I hit it a variety of different ones. Mostly Judeo-Christian, I think, would be the emphasis. I spend a lot less time on Buddhism or Hinduism. But certainly Islam figures fairly prominently in there, and then mostly Christianity throughout the book. And it's not just U.S. focused. I mean, most of it is focused on the U.S., but there's a fair amount of international data. And that's just something that, I wanted to make sure as I was writing this book, which the book is chock full of data. That's one of the major kind of points of the book, is I wanted to have data from around the world. And I really do, from over 80 countries, illustrating that the patterns that we're talking about in there, they hold everywhere.
I will present to you the question I just saw presented to me on Facebook not 20 minutes ago. If you're a non-believer in religious stuff, why are you so obsessed with religion? Why such a deep focus on all this stuff? What drives that?
It's a great question. And I think it deserves a little bit of a nuanced answer. Most of the people in, say, Western Europe, where they're far more secularized than we are, they're not interested in religion. And I think the end state of secularization, or the declining influence and relevance of religion in society, I think the end state is actually indifference rather than antagonism or opposition. For many people who are opposed to it, who are so kind of uptight about religion, it's because they've had really bad experiences with it. Religion is pervasive in the US, pervasive in many parts of the world, not everywhere, but pervasive. And it can be a really, really awful experience for people. Religion is a very powerful tool, particularly when it comes to things like mind control, behavioral control. It certainly pervades aspects of our lives that are really important, like our sexuality. And it teaches things that are like just different beliefs and ideas and practices and behaviors that are pernicious. And they're pernicious in often very, very unhealthy ways. And so as people extricate themselves from religion and its tendrils that have worked their way into their brains, they get mad. They feel like they've been victimized, which in some sense they really have. They're victims to an ideology and a belief system that just overwhelmingly takes over every aspect of their lives. And so in the process of extricating themselves, they get really, really angry. For many people, I think what happens over time is as they work through that anger, they're mad, but it's hard to maintain that level of anger. So a lot of people, after a period of time, once you're out and you know it's been years, the anger starts to ebb, and then you're like, you know what? I'm ready to move on. I've got other interests, right? I'm going to spend my life doing other things. But I think that's really what it is for most people who are really, you know, they're out and they're atheists or they're agnostics or whatever they are. They're still angry about religion or they're upset about religion. It's because religion has done damage to them. That literally has victimized them in a really horrible and pernicious way. And so they have to deal with it.
I feel like you've been looking in my windows, man. I mean, there's a little bit of that with me. I mean, I was pissed off that I felt like I had not been given a shot, the opportunity or the tools to carve a path of my own. I'm now sort of being emotionally blackmailed to try to come back. The prodigal must come home. It's sort of tainted the relationship I have with my family. And I've translated, especially in the early years, you can see that in the temperature of the stuff that I'd produced. It's pretty biting and there's some anger and sarcasm. And I've become softer in the last few years. I guess that must be a very common thing, huh?
Yeah, it seems like it. And certainly that's, you know, one of the aims of my book is I don't want to paint religion with this broad brush and basically say, well, there's religion and there's non-religion and all religion is the same and it's all fundamentalist. And it's just patently false. Like it's not true. And I think there needs to be more discussion in the atheist community about the nuances of religion, because what you actually have are a lot of what I call in the book liberally religious people, and we can get into that later, but they're basically people who accept science. They've rejected the parts of their religion that counter or contradict science. They basically are kind of on the same side, except they hold on to some intangible, non-falsifiable beliefs about some supernatural entity. Those aren't the people who scare me. Those aren't the people who really bother me. It's the fundamentalists who are willing to blow up buildings and themselves and planes and kill people in the name of their religion. Those are the ones who are scary, and those are the ones who we need to be fighting. And actually, our allies in that battle are really the liberally religious. So I think for many people, as you distance yourself from the harm that religion has done to you, you begin to realize that there's a lot more nuance in the world of religion, and that maybe it's not all. And don't get me wrong here. I'm not saying that, you know, there aren't problems with even that kind of religion, but maybe it's not all just horrible, evil, terrible, you know, nastiness. Some people are perfectly fine, right? Like, do your own thing. That's cool. You can believe in stuff that I can't disprove. It's cool, you know, whatever you want to do, but just keep it to yourself.
Yeah, once it results in some sort of an actionable thing where you're beginning to rewrite science books and you're infecting political systems. And again, that speaks to fundamentalism, right? Somebody holds a personal faith because it makes them feel warm and fuzzy. Knock yourself out, right? That's no skin off my teeth.
Exactly.
My fight is going to be with those who are down in Texas and, you know, the Texas Board of Education folks who make me want to claw my eyeballs out about every 3 months.
I hear you. Oh, yeah.
All right. Talking with Dr. Ryan Cragun about his book called What You Don't Know About Religion But Should. Let's hit one bullet point here. Religious people, are they stupid? Are they less educated? Let's talk about the facts and the myths in this regard.
Okay. So I'm not going to go so far as to call them stupid, but the evidence, that's a terrible but the evidence does suggest that they score lower on IQ tests than atheists and even non-religious people. The less religious you are, and the higher you score an IQ test. Now, I understand, and there may be some people, you know, maybe some people trained in psychology or a variety of different disciplines who have called into question IQ tests. Admittedly, there are problems. At the same time, they still function fairly well. But the tricky part about that is we don't know causality. Causality could go either way, and that's the tricky part, and I always want to kind of try and give the nuance. The evidence is pretty clear that there's a correlation. The more religious you are, the lower your IQ. But is it because you're raised religious, and as a result, and we actually know this, people who are raised in fundamentalist religions are discouraged from pursuing higher levels of education. So to what degree that actually ends up reducing their IQ, we can't say definitively. I don't think I've seen anybody really do a good study on that. Or it could be, you know, the inverse, that because you have a lower IQ, religion's more appealing to you. Honestly, we don't know the answer to that. It's a great study that somebody needs to do. Maybe I'll do it at some point in the future. But the evidence is pretty compelling that they have lower levels of education. So religious fundamentalists in particular, lower levels of education and lower IQs than non-religious people. And then particularly if you want like the extreme of that, atheists have the highest IQs, highest levels of education. Now, again, that's fundamentalists versus atheists. If you're looking at kind of the many different striations of religion, Actually, kind of Reformed Jews and Unitarian Universalists, they score right up there in terms of IQ and levels of education with atheists. So there are clearly religious people who score really, really well in this, but, you know, they're Unitarians and Reformed Jews, which how religious they are, you know, that's certainly up for question.
Well, it's somewhat of a loaded question. When I throw it out there, obviously, I don't think religious people by default are stupid. I mean, I was religious for 30 years. I would be essentially saying I was an idiot during that time. And I think there were other factors at play having to do with indoctrination and environment and perhaps even what Dale McGowan calls a greater desire to believe than to know.
Right.
You know? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, but I can see if you say something or sort of allude to something like, well, atheists score higher on IQ test, I can already see an ocean of people who are rushing to their social media pages to post something along those lines. And so we advise caution, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, be careful when you say that. It's true. Like, I can send you the studies. The studies are cited in my book. We've known this for a very long time. But be careful, because we can't immediately say the causal direction is religion makes you dumb. Like, I can't definitively say that. If I could say that, I would. Like, I would love to be able to say religion makes you stupid. I can't. And so you just be cautious, right? Tell all your friends. Sure, right? You know, religious people are less intelligent. It's true. It's true. But there you go.
I saw a recent video with Richard Dawkins, and it was a setup where he was in a classroom loaded with nothing but religious students. Mm-hmm. And he was educating them about evolution. And then they were given the chance to question this evolutionary biologist about what evolution is and isn't. Each was defending his or her specific religion, and listening to just the dearth of education that had apparently taken place in the lives of these young people, you know, quoting the Quran to prove the Quran, quoting the Bible to prove the Bible. Why hasn't man evolved into something else like tomorrow? You know, those types of things. If you take a religious person, and you may not know the answer, you take a religious person and you place them in an environment where they are surrounded by good information, is it expected that they'll start to change their mind? I mean, is being surrounded with good information, is that the next logical step?
It's a great question, because you would think, like, well, if I just give them good, accurate information, that would do it. Turns out that's probably not the case. But I will tell you this, there is something that is fairly effective, and that's changing people's social network. If you can get them, so, and this is really, it says something about the nature of humans, right? We're very good at finding justifications for our beliefs. So even if you were to put somebody into an environment where they're kind of, you know, they're surrounded with good information, chances are they're just going to find ways to undermine everything that you're telling them, right? But if you can literally change their social network to where the people they know, the people they hang out with, the people they spend time with are non-believers, are critical, are skeptical, chances are they will eventually become that way too. That's a much more effective way of actually changing people's beliefs than just trying to convince them. You know, and I'm sure you've done this. I'm sure most of your listeners have tried at some point or another to convince somebody that what they believe is just patently false. It's not true. It's a logical fallacy. Talking people out of their beliefs is really, really hard because of the way that our minds work. But if you can slowly, kind of like, you know, they say how the devil slowly leads people to hell. But if you can slowly work them out by rearranging their friendship networks, that's actually a far more effective way of doing it.
I saw you do a presentation. Was it in Florida?
Yeah, in Florida.
You had a wonderful presentation which dealt with many of the myths or questions about atheist and religious people. Are we happier? Are we sadder? Are we more miserable? Are we more or less moral? Are we more or less racist? Very interesting stuff. Would you mind addressing a little bit of that here on the radio for us?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, that's kind of the big focus of the book, right? I really do want people to understand that non-religious people, or leaving religion, is not going to make you this, you know, immoral hedonist. I mean, it just doesn't happen that way. So as far as things like health, turns out religion doesn't make people healthy. I mean, there's just no evidence for it, and I go into a lot of detail in the book. But when you do really fair comparisons, and you can do all sorts of stuff with statistics to basically control for a variety of things. Are there some religions that encourage healthy behaviors? Absolutely. So Mormons, for instance, have lower incidences of cancer. Same with Seventh-day Adventists. And largely that's because they discourage smoking. Wow, shocker, right? Not smoking reduces your incidence of cancer. Like, really, that's not that hard to conceptualize. That's pretty straightforward. But people then want to say, see, and it's religion that does this. When you start controlling, so a great way to compare this is if you were to take two identical individuals, literally identical twins, and have one who goes to church, pick a church, doesn't matter, and another who doesn't, and they engage in all the same behaviors, is there any reason to think that the one who goes to church is going to be healthier? Absolutely not. Now, throw in smoking, right? What if both of these identical twins who are healthy in every other way, but they both smoke? Is the one who goes to church going to have his lungs cleaned out by the waters of baptism because he somehow goes to church and it's magical? Absolutely not. They're both at the same levels of risk because they both smoke. So religion is not going to make you any healthier. Is being non-religious going to make you healthier? No. It turns out it's sixes. Literally, there's like no difference. Occasionally, you will find slightly higher levels of social support for people who regularly go to church. That's true, right? Because they have a social network, a support network at church. But you can certainly get that outside of church too. So there's no reason to think that religion makes you healthier.
If I may, if you have a positive mental state and it's because you are participating in what you see to be a life mission or any number of church-related things, all right, you feel better, which means you are happier, perhaps healthier in that way. I mean, is there any data to suggest that even a happy fantasy might provide some physical benefit to you?
It's a good question. I'm trying to think of any studies off the top of my head.
Might be something to, more for Andy Thompson. I know I spoke to him about, they were talking about like the placebo effect and whatnot. So
yeah, I mean, I do refer to it as a happiness delusion, kind of playing off of Richard Dawkins. So when we're talking, so that's it's a mixture of health and happiness stuff. But there is some evidence in the U.S., less so in other developed countries, but in the U.S. that religious fundamentalists are a little bit happier. And I like to call it a delusion. Part of the reason why I call it a delusion is because one thing we know, which is kind of interesting, is people who suffer from clinical depression, they actually see the world in more realistic ways. They actually remember with better detail what actually happened versus what they want to believe happened. And what that basically means, that is, if you're not clinically depressed, you're basically not seeing reality. The rest of us are walking around moderately deluded most of the time. And of course, the causality thing, again, is a little bit tricky here. We don't know if people who are clinically depressed are seeing the world in more realistic ways because they're clinically depressed, or they're clinically depressed because they see the world in more realistic ways. We honestly don't know the causal direction here. But what does that say about religious fundamentalists? Well, we already know that they believe certain things that are just not true, right? They basically live in a fantasy world. And I don't mean that to be pejorative. I mean, it is kind of pejorative, but I don't really mean it that way. They believe in things that are demonstrably false. And they live in a world where there are lots of things that they believe in that aren't real. They're deluded. And one of the things that they also believe is that their religion makes them happier. Turns out, if you use more objective criteria, like prescriptions of antidepressants, turns out there's a pretty good correlation at the state level between level of religiosity. The more religious the state, the higher the degree, or the higher the number of antidepressant prescriptions. So they think that they're happier. They will portray themselves as though they're happier. They will even respond on surveys that they're happier. But when you actually dig into it and use more objective criteria, it doesn't look like that's the case. So I don't think the evidence is there to suggest that you actually get any psychological benefit from religion, any kind of the social maybe, but like a happiness benefit, absolutely not. And it turns out when you look internationally and do international comparisons, controlling for a variety of different factors, non-religious people are actually just as happy, sometimes happier, depending on the level of religiosity of a country. So the more religious a country, the less happy the minority group that is non-religious actually is. And a lot of that is due to discrimination and prejudice against them.
I'm reminded of that quote by Hemingway, "Happiness in intelligent people is the rarest thing I know." Now, he's probably not a great measuring stick, as he killed himself, right?
He did.
But I'm reminded of that quote. Sometimes if you see a starker world, a harsher world, that happy, it's almost like the Eloi in H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, right? They're happy and blissful, frolicking on the surface, but
oblivious.
right below the surface is an entire world of other people who are sort of pulling the strings of things that are happening.
Yeah. That's a lot of truth to that.
Let's talk about prejudice. And this is a controversial one. One that certainly raised an eyebrow when I saw you give this speech. We talk about acceptance. We talk about red and yellow, black and white. We are precious in his sight when we are religious. Are we more or less racist? And I was thinking maybe you could sort of approach that here for us.
Absolutely. I mean, this is one that there's no question. We've known this, social scientists have known this since the 1950s. The more fundamentalist you are, the more prejudiced you are towards anybody in your outgroup. So you basically dislike any sexual minorities, racial minorities, religious minorities, political minorities. There's just no question about it. You look at the numbers, they are far more prejudiced than non-religious people. Liberally religious people are also slightly more prejudiced than non-religious people, but much less so than religious fundamentalists. And this is true on any target group that you want to use. So religious fundamentalists are more prejudiced towards blacks, towards Hispanics, towards Asians, Native Americans, you name any racial group. Sexual minorities, I actually just published a paper this year that showed the exact same thing. The more religious fundamentalist you are, the greater antipathy you have towards homosexuals, bisexuals, transgender individuals, and even polygamists. It doesn't matter who you throw in, as long as they are part of the outgroup, religious fundamentalists dislike them more. And that's like a definitive finding. Basically, no social scientists at this point even try to challenge that. What they'll try to do is cover it up if they personally are religious, because it makes them look so bad.
Wow. Is it we're right, you're wrong, or is it a sort of, I know you're not a psychologist, but are we talking about insecurities? I mean, what drives that?
Part of it is kind of what the first one, we're right, you're wrong. Religious fundamentalists do see the world in black and white terms. And so anybody who engages in a behavior that they simply disagree with, or that would put them out of their religious categorization as the good people, God people, whichever group they are in, then inherently, for that very reason, you've got to be inferior. Whatever you believe, whatever you have, that makes you inferior to what they have. And I don't mean that in like a human rights sense, right? Like you're equal value, but inferior in terms of your morality, in terms of your righteousness, etc. And as a result, they simply think of them as different. Now, another thing, and you may have seen this in the presentation that I like to point out, is that religions are groups. Like, by definition, that's what they are. They're collective beliefs regarding the supernatural. And one thing that we've known, social psychology taught us this quite a while ago, is that groups by their very nature are divisive. So if somebody is not in your group, just because they're not in your group, because they have out-group characteristics, you like them less well than somebody who's in your in-group. You could literally have an asshole in your in-group who, is a total jerk, but because they're in your in-group, chances are you're going to like them better than somebody who's in your out-group. So it's just the very nature of religion is divisive. Religion, because it forms groups, and it particularly fundamentalist religion that says, and we're right and everybody else is wrong, right? That it's very exclusive in the way that they think about things. Because they do that, it's basically setting the world up for prejudice. To say, well, we've got better beliefs and therefore you're inferior. And, the fundamentalists, some will take it so far as to say, and as a result, God says you should die.
You said a word a couple of times, and my guest from last week, Cara Santa Maria, said the word as well, nuanced thinking. Nuance, these complex issues that we deal with, and yet, especially when I was religious, I tended to just see yes, no, good, bad, black, white, Jesus, devil, right? It was very simple. It was like Legoland for the mind. And so when you mention this is a common thing in religion. It's got to be this or this, and there's no gray. If it's gray, now we've somehow watered down our belief system. Is that an accurate way to say it?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's kind of how we use our criteria for somebody being a religious fundamentalist. Both sociologists and psychologists, we both use the same criteria, which is basically if you decontextualize scripture, so scripture is literal to you, and if you're a black and white thinker, if you only see the world as having black and white and no shades of gray in between, then we're basically going to call you a fundamentalist. Now, it's not just religious people who do that, right? There are others who do that as well, and this is part of the reason why I wrote the book, is I want non-religious people, and particularly atheist activists, to recognize that we need to engage in nuanced thinking too. not all religion, we can't, like I said, paint all religion with one big broad brush and say that it's all bad. There's a lot of variety there. But certainly religion does this. And it's not all religion, but fundamentalist religion basically wants to convince all the world we have truth, capital T truth, right? The truth. There's only one, we have it. Everybody else is wrong. And as a result, it does force everything into a dichotomy. It's either true or it's false. It's right or it's wrong. And it makes the world simple. It's very convenient. I mean, wouldn't it be nice if that's really how the world was? It's like, well, there's just truth and there's falsehood. But the world's far more complicated than that. And for many of them, I think literally they just don't want to have to think. They don't want to have to worry about these things. They just want somebody to tell them, well, this is right and that's wrong. And if you do it, you'll go to heaven. That's simple. It's nice. It's convenient. It's a great little package. Turns them into not very nice people.
I guess we're all hypocrites about something. I mean, you try to be conscious of it. You try to do your best to know your own mind, to make sure that your actions fit your convictions, that kind of thing. But I couldn't help but smile when I read this recent study that had just come out about how religious and conservative states have a higher search ratio for porn. I'm looking at this and it was like they just sort of mapped out all 50 states and said, here's who's searching in Google for sex, gay sex, porn, XXX, free porn, gay porn. And it was mostly the religious states. And I thought to myself, is it do what I say, not as I do? Is it this weird repression where, they go to Sunday church and then they run home and Google search naked people? I mean, I don't know. Have you looked into this at all?
I have. I've been writing, actually, some of my recent research has been looking at how religious leaders in the Mormon church conceptualize pornography. And there's actually been, there's some great research that came out this year that your listeners really should look at. Basically, what the research finds is that the idea of addiction to pornography, it's almost exclusive to religious people. It's not entirely, right? But religious people are far more likely to believe that they're addicted to pornography than anybody else. And the reason why is because they're told that it's bad, that it's wrong, that it's immoral, right? And so when they do it, they feel like they're addicted because once they've done it once, right, they can't get it out of their mind because it's bad, and so they fixate on it. And of course, then they want to believe that it's an addiction, when in fact it's perfectly normal to do that. Like, that's fine, right? Like, there's nothing wrong with it. So there's really good research on that aspect of it. There have been a number of studies that have come out, like this one that you're just mentioning, talking about the higher incidence of subscribing to pornography and searching for porn in the more conservative, more religious states. We don't have a really good answer for why that is the case, other than kind of just this latent need to go out and do these things, right? I think what is probably contributing to it is that in the more progressive states, or more liberal states, people who aren't as religious, they're not as fixated about it. And they know where, so if you're doing Google searches, right, that means you probably don't know where to find it.
Is it like the forbidden fruit thing then? It's if you are not sort of putting it in a box and hiding it in the closet and saying, don't go in there. If you don't do that, it sort of demystifies it and you have a healthier approach to it. Is that it?
100%, right? If it's not a bad thing, like, and I don't mean to simplify this, right? Again, we can go into a lot of nuance in here, but for people who aren't religious, if they want, they're feeling a sexual urge and they want to masturbate, it takes however long it takes, right? For some it's short, for others maybe a little bit longer, whatever. But then it's done and it's like out of your mind, and then you move on and you do whatever you're going to do the rest of the day. And don't get me wrong. I mean, I think some people actually have problems with pornography. Like, that's legit, but it's a very small percentage. But for people who don't think that looking at porn is a sin, you use it and you move on with the rest of your day. It's those who think it's a sin that they fixate on it and all they can think about. And so it does become a problem in their life, but it's a problem because they believe it should be a problem. And it shouldn't. Like, there's no reason to think that this should be a problem, but they've been taught that that's what it is. And so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Your religious leaders tell you, don't look at porn, it's addictive. And so you're like, oh, God, I should go look at porn. Like, what is this thing, right? You look, and then you're like, wow, I actually feel good doing that. That was pleasurable, but I'm not supposed to do it. But you keep wanting it, right? And now you can't get it out of your mind, and so you're waiting for your next fix. It's almost like you're a junkie. Whereas the person who's not fixated on this and doesn't think that it's sinful, we do it, we move on, like, get on with the rest of your day. and we'll do it again when we need to.
Coming from the Mormon church, I'm also thinking at the moment at the Catholic Church, how we have an entire culture of religious people who are getting sexual advice from what are occasionally supposedly lifetime celibates. Do we really want the people advising us about sex to be the people who have such an unhealthy view of sex to begin with, or just have no experience with it, right? I've sworn sex off. I'm married to Jesus. Now let me advise you on how you should be.
It makes no sense.
It makes
none whatsoever.
No sense whatsoever. Talking here with Dr. Ryan Cragun about his book called What You Don't Know About Religion But Should. I will link that book in the description box of this podcast for you. Let's talk about Islam. You have done some work on Islam, studying what Islam is and what it isn't. The big discussion I see now is it a religious force? Is it a political force? Now we're back to nuanced thinking. Some say they don't actually believe the Quran. They just use it as a prop, as an excuse to be a political movement or promote a political ideology or whatever. And others say, no, they are absolutely adherent to the Quran. They are religious zealots. And so this seems to be the discussion. What is Islam? Is it a religious thing or a political thing? And do, the radical elements of Islam accurately represent Islam as a whole, that kind of thing?
So certainly Islam is not my forte, but I think there are a couple of things that are worth noting that are a little bit tricky. And these are a couple of things that I kind of tackle in the book. So one of the ones, and this actually, it stems from a class. I was teaching a class on the social psychology, actually. It's quite a while ago. And in there, we were talking about the ability of religion to convince people that they are so right that they engage in acts of violence in the name of their religion. And one of my students, I was giving examples, right? So I was talking about, for instance, some of the conservative fundamentalist Christians who have killed doctors who perform abortions. And I said, they did this in the name of Christianity. And one of my students was like, well, no, they can't be Christians. They can't be Christians because a Christian would never do that. And I was like, well, that's actually a logical fallacy, right? It's the no true Scotsman fallacy. No true Christian would kill somebody in the name of their religion. One of the things that bothers me, and I'm kind of being critical of Islam, I can be defensive of Islam in other ways, but we'll be critical to begin with here, is often when you see something horrible done in the name of Islam, pretty quickly, the defenders of Islam will come out and say, that's not Islam. That's culture. Culture did that, right? And I give a very specific example in the book about a young woman in Canada. The family was from Pakistan. They were living in Canada, and she just wasn't conforming to the standards that the family had set, particularly the dad. She didn't want to wear the hijab. She was basically living a more materialistic Canadian lifestyle. And as a result, the dad and one of her older brothers literally strangled her to death in their home. And immediately, the defenders of Islam, more moderate Muslims, came out and said, well, that's Pakistani culture, right? Like that has nothing to do with Islam. Well, the reason why I really, really hate that argument is because religion is part of culture. And so when you're saying it's just culture, I would challenge anybody to be able to try and intricately divest religion from culture and be able to show me, no, this is exclusive to that culture and has nothing to do with the religion. What they're doing is they're doing the same thing that student in my class did. It's the no true Scotsman fallacy. They're trying to say, no, this is not religion that's responsible for these horrific acts. Even if that person said, well, I did this in the name of my religion, it's their culture. No, it's not, right? Maybe it's both. That's fine. I'll go with both. But own it. If they're Christians who are doing horrible things in the name of their religion, then they're Christians who are doing it. And you can't pull them out and say they're not Christians. And if it's Muslims who are doing it, or Buddhists, or Hindus, or Jews, they all do horrible things in the name of their religion. And at the end of the day, what determines whether they're part of the religion? It's self-identification. If they say I did this in the name of my religion, they have to own it. That is what it is. Anyway, so that's kind of one point that I like to make about Islam in particular, because it's often, when there's some act of violence or terrorism, Muslims get criticized, not always fairly, and that's the other side that I'd go to, but often the defense is, no, that was not Islam, that was culture, and I think that's bullshit. It's actually probably both.
It's interesting for me sometimes to see the occasions when a religion does or does not police itself. If you represent a certain faith and you go out and you commit a horrific act, then all of the other people in the faith who are more mainstream come out and say, this is insane. We condemn this. It's horrible. Like a Baptist or Assembly of God or Lutheran church condemning someone who blows up an abortion clinic in the name of Jesus. They see an extreme act and they immediately come forward and publicly denounce. Many people, when they see a horrific act done in the name of Allah, are asking, where are the Islamic organizations, where are the Muslim churches who are coming out and crying foul and saying, we condemn this as much as you do? I know it does happen, but it doesn't happen as often as one would think, unless we're just not seeing the full picture.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is absolutely correct. What's a little bit problematic is you basically have to own it and then turn around and say, but that's not our interpretation. So you can't say, they're not Muslims or they're not Christians. They are. Like, own that. They are Christians or they are Muslims or they are Jews. But the way we interpret our religion means that we reject what they do, what they're doing, what they're believing, how they interpret this. And I think that's the nuance that is missing there, because they want to push that away from themselves, right? They want to distance themselves from what has actually happened and say, well, that's not us. That's fine. You can do that. But at the same time, you can't say, but then they're also not Christians, or that they're not Catholics or Episcopalians or Baptists or whoever they are, or Muslims. You can't say that. What you have to say is, sure, they're Muslims, but that's not our interpretation of Islam. Sure, they're Christians, but that's not our interpretation of Christianity. And you're right. I think we need more people doing that, because really the only way to win, in my opinion, the battle with fundamentalist religion is to at least initially encourage moderate religion. If we can get the moderates to basically help us defeat the fundamentalists, then if we want to turn our attention to the moderates, fine. But right now, the bigger threat really is the fundamentalists. And so that's where we need to focus our attention, is dealing with the moderates. And that was my other point about Islam, is one thing that we need to realize is that most of the Muslims in the world are not fundamentalists. They're not the extremists who want to blow themselves up or blow other people up or, take over the world. Most of them are actually moderates. There are actually some who are quite progressive, quite liberal. And I know there's been some discussion in the atheist community that the moderates basically allow the fundamentalists to exist, and they kind of, by their very existence, they're legitimating them. I don't actually agree with that. I think the best solution to dealing with the fundamentalist threat, that is a real threat around the world today, is to kind of support the moderates for now. Let's get rid of the fundamentalists first, and then we'll deal with the next step. It was funny. I was talking to Nate Phelps, the son of the late pastor of Westboro, the patriarch of Westboro, Fred Phelps, and how when Westboro would protest a funeral of a soldier or something, you would see the First Baptist Church, or the What's Happening Now on the corner, would come out and say, they don't represent true Christianity. And of course, Nate said, well, if you look at Westboro and you look at a literal scripture, oh yeah, they're actually pretty close, right? Yep. They're not counterfeit Christians. They're actually taking just a more literal fundamentalist view of the Christian Bible. It's interesting. Yep. Oh yeah, it's absolutely correct, and that, that's true for many religions. Certainly there are ways to interpret the scripture differently. So you don't have to do those kinds of things, but a straightforward reading of it is what it is. I mean, and that's why I said, okay, let's get them to admit that there are different ways to interpret scripture first. And it's a slippery slope, and it's beautiful, right? I love to talk to my students about this. As soon as you can get them to concede that not all scriptural is literal, well, then where do we stop? Right? Yeah. So that's really just the first step. If we can get them to take that step, hey, we've got a long slope to go down at that point, and it's a pretty easy slope. It's a slippery slope, but it's that first step, and I think that's really where we need to kind of focus is on that first step. The book and sort of the theme of this show, What You Don't Know About Religion But Should. I don't want you to read the book on the radio. I'm obviously want to lead people that direction, but give me some good stuff here. What are some things that we should know about religion but don't? So a couple that are kind of fun, and one that I actually think, and you may have seen this in my presentation in Florida because it's actually a very, very popular one, is I talk about religion and arrogance or pride. And this is often a tool that is used by the religious in debating or discussing with non-religious people, often they will say, oh, well, you don't believe because you're just so arrogant. You're so proud, right? If you would humble yourself before God, then you would believe and you would see the error of your ways. And I've been accused of this, right? And I talk about that in the book, but it's basically doublespeak. They've taken the words humility and pride or arrogance, and they've literally flipped them on their head to suggest they mean the exact opposite of what they actually mean. So often when they're accusing people of being arrogant, what they're really saying is, you're asking questions of authority. And if you think about what it really means to be humble, it's admitting that you don't know. So when they're saying, oh, you're arrogant because you're questioning, no, that's actually humility. Like, that's literally what it means to be humble. But for some reason, they're able to compellingly make that argument and say, oh, those atheists, they're so arrogant. But asking questions is not arrogant. That's actually precisely the opposite. And then, of course, in the inverse, they're saying, well, it's humble to be obedient and to do what God says. But at the same time, they're claiming to know what God says, which is arrogant. They've literally switched those two terms around. And so I have a whole chapter just talking about what this means. And then I provide, conveniently, really good data. Like I said, all of the chapters in this book have data to back up the arguments that I'm making. Because there's data to support these arguments. And I think the atheist, free thought, skeptical movements, they should have this data ready on hand. So when somebody says you're arrogant, you can turn around and say, turns out non-religious people are actually more humble. And we have really compelling evidence to support that. And here's the evidence, and that you can actually show it to them. I did this on a different podcast, and if you're okay with it on this one, if people want to, you can email me and I will send you that chapter, because I just think everybody should have this, right? Ready on hand to be able to share with anybody and say, you know what, turns out, I've got the evidence to back up what I'm saying. You're probably the arrogant one, because religious people are far more arrogant than are non-religious people. So that's one of the chapters that I'd love to highlight. And like I said, just email me. I will send you the chapter. Happy to do so.
Well, I'll have your website in the description box as well. People can go and contact you directly there. That's fantastic. There's a chapter in your book called Where Would Jesus Volunteer? And it speaks to charity. I hear this quite a bit. How can you be charitable, or you are less charitable? You care less because you don't hold to a deity. Is there any data on whether or not you are more or less charitable as a religious person?
Yeah, there are data. And this is another one where it's just nice to have the data to back this up, right? And the title of the chapter is kind of suggesting what I ultimately conclude. It depends on how you ask the questions about doing volunteering and donating money, okay? So if you're asking people, well, how often do you do volunteer work? Many religious people will include ushering at their church as volunteering, teaching Sunday school as volunteering, or preparing the coffee and cakes afterwards as volunteering. So they'll say, oh, well, I do 3 hours a week volunteering, and I do it every week. It's at my church. Well, I don't really see that as volunteering, and you could say, oh, come on, you should include that as volunteering. But I mean, isn't that the equivalent of just like hanging out with your buddies? That's like saying I brought the beer. So that's 2 hours of volunteering because I had to go shopping for it, and I had to bring it. For the game that we watched, I brought the beer, and that's volunteering. I mean, that's not volunteering, but many of them will include that. So when you actually separate out volunteering in a religious context versus volunteering for a charitable end, like building homes for poor people or serving soup at a soup kitchen, there's no difference. Statistically, there is not a bit of a difference in terms of how much volunteering people do in the US. If you go internationally, and I'm really thinking of data from Europe, it turns out non-religious people are actually slightly more likely to volunteer than are religious people. Again, when you divorce it from the religious context. So as far as volunteering, we have good data separating out volunteering in a religious context from not, and non-religious people are no less likely to volunteer. As far as donating money, this is another one where historically they've conflated the two. So they'll basically say, well, how much money do you give to charitable causes? religions are not that charitable, right? I've written entire articles about how horrible they come as far as being charitable. But if you don't separate those out, that's really not that fair, because it's pretty easy to make the argument that people who are donating to the religion, it's kind of the equivalent of paying like your gym dues. You're paying because you have to go. Like, you don't technically have to in some of them. I mean, if you're Jewish, you kind of do have to. But in many of them, there's like this moral obligation to pay. And then you go and you're entertained, or you go and you're enlightened, if you want to call it that. But you're paying your dues. So we should really equate donations, quote unquote, to religions with gym dues, or how much money you spend at the coffee shop, or going to a movie theater, right? That would make it equivalent. So when you actually ask, well, how much money do you give to charitable causes that are not religions? Turns out there's not a bit of difference there. A couple of studies have actually found that non-religious people give more, but I would actually probably call it a wash. It's probably pretty close to being about equal. So it turns out religion doesn't make people any more charitable in the terms of volunteering or donating money if you're not including, religion, like volunteering for church or donating to church. If you're just looking at secular charitable causes, turns out there's no difference at all.
You remind me of an anecdote. I was at a mega church in Dallas years and years ago, and they showed a video to the congregation that showed the pastor and church leaders all going out to a restaurant, and they all ordered some of the best stuff on the menu. I mean, just the creme de la creme of everything, including dessert. And they thanked the waitstaff, and they enjoyed themselves immensely. And when it was over, they all just got up and left without paying. And the lights came up at the church, and the pastor looked at the congregation and said, "Many of you people who come here every Sunday and get benefit, who are not tithing, are essentially doing what we did in the video. You guys are walking the check." The entire message was an attitude of expectation. It wasn't true charity. It was, you are returning to the storehouse, right? It already belongs to God. So I can totally see what you're talking about. Is it a genuine act of goodness and humanity and charity and trying to make the world a better place? Or are you simply paying the monthly fee? That kind of thing.
Exactly. You're paying your dues. They're monthly dues. I mean, that's what you do. So to call that charity, I don't buy it. And I mean, if you wanted to get into it, some religions, the most charitable religions, and I use that term very loosely, in terms of taking money that comes in as revenue and then sending that back out to address the physical needs of people who are in need, the most charitable ones spend about 30% of their revenue on charitable causes. That's the most charitable. The least charitable, the LDS Church, probably ranks right up there. They spend about 0.07% of their total revenue on addressing the physical needs of people who are actually struggling. I mean, it's astonishing. They're like the worst charities on the planet. 70% of their revenue, at a minimum, goes towards overhead and paying, pastors' salaries and all sort, keeping the building warm, keeping the building maintained. Most of their money goes right back into the church, and that's fine. Like, that's fine. Just don't call them charities. Call them what they are. They're religious clubs, and you're paying your club dues.
You talk in your book about, there's a chapter called All Babies Are Atheists. Why belief in a specific God is not innate. Now, of course, a few months ago, everybody was passing this article around, especially religious people, who all sent it to me with a kind of an aha kind of a tone. It said, cognitive scientists are becoming increasingly aware that a metaphysical outlook may be so deeply ingrained in human thought processes it cannot be expunged. Essentially, they're saying that even atheists are born with an innate belief in God. I'll let you speak to that, sir.
Oh, so frustrating.
Well, what's even more frustrating is I actually pulled this one. It's been reposted a million times. I actually pulled this one from a website called Evolution News. It's evolutionnews.org. Well, it's deceptive because it's a creationist website. It's an intelligent design. It's a totally apologetic evangelical thing, brandishing the word evolution in its title in an attempt to get people there and to seek legitimacy. So I understand the facepalm that's going on your side, Ryan.
Oh, yeah.
But let's talk about babies. Are they born with or without belief? What's the story?
Right. So, babies are born without belief. I mean, that's like a given. There are no Republican or Democratic babies. Like, that's just the reality, right? They have to be taught to believe in certain things. Now, where you're getting at those studies, right, is this idea that humans have this ability to see intent in nature. And so that can get translated into the idea of like, when your computer malfunctions, like that, I hate my computer. Well, it's a box, right? Like it's just a bunch of non-intelligent stuff, right? That's just doing things, and occasionally it malfunctions. But we have a tendency to kind of anthropomorphize and see intent in things, and that's true. And there's probably a reason for that, and it could be evolutionary. We call it the hyperactive agency detection device. That if we don't see intent in things that actually do have intent, like a tiger hiding in the branches behind a tree, then, if we don't see that intent, it's going to eat us and we will die and our species will die out. So we're actually really good at seeing intention in nature. But that doesn't mean that we immediately are seeing gods in nature. That's a great misattribution error, right? What we're seeing is intention. How that gets translated into belief in God is somebody has to teach people to believe that. There are a number of stories in the book about my son, and he was a little bit younger, but I have a 5-year-old son. We've had the God talk already. He doesn't believe in God, right? As soon as I explained it to him, he's like, yeah, it's totally cool. I get what some people believe, but it doesn't mean anything to him. It's a completely meaningless term, and he never thinks about it. He doesn't run around, all day long going, yeah, I saw this branch moving on a tree, and clearly it had to be God. As soon as somebody told him, well, some people believe in God, but we don't. And so that idea that maybe there's intention in nature, because we see it, we perceive it, not that there actually is intention in nature, that may be innate. But in order for it to be associated with a specific God, that has to be taught. You have to teach that. And if it's never taught, or if you teach kids the opposite, and this is actually an area where I take some issue with non-religious people. A lot of non-religious people are like, I'm going to let my kids explore and they can figure out if they want religion or not. You know what? Why? Why would you do that? Why not just express your own views to them? Teach them what you think. If they later want to change their opinion on that, right? If they later decide that they want to believe in a God, that's fine. But why should we just open it up for the entire, spectrum and let them go explore without having a little bit of a guidepost? And tell them, well, we thought about a lot of things and we ultimately concluded what we did. Anyway, sorry, tangent. But
well, isn't that wait? Are we splitting hairs here? Or are we saying I'm going to tell you what I think? I'm not telling you what you will think. I mean, there's a difference, absolutely. Right? I mean, just say, look, I found compelling evidence. I don't think there's good evidence here. This is where I'm at. I think you'll probably draw the same conclusion. But ultimately, the choice is yours. I think that's a healthy approach, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. But I'll often hear non-religious people like, I'm just going to let them explore. Well, that's fine. Let them explore, but why not tell them where you stand? And then when they do explore, interact with them, discuss it, right? Point out the problems, and that's fine. But don't just be like, I'm not going to say anything. Let them figure it out on their own. That just drives me nuts, right? It's like,
all right.
Why? Anyway, sorry, total tangent. But back to the all babies are atheists. Hopefully I explained that. It's not that they have an innate belief in God. Maybe we have an innate sense of finding intent in nature, and that's fine, right? Maybe we do. But in order for that to get translated into a belief in a specific God, it clearly has to be taught. And there's no question about that in the scientific community.
There are 28 chapters in here. I just want to hit one more point, and then I'll sort of point everybody toward the actual book, which I love because it is something you can sink your teeth into and you can refer back to, you can make notes in as you have these discussions. I mean, Dr. Cragun's right. I mean, it's data. It's stuff that's been researched, and you can source in these discussions. I was talking to a religious person. I always find myself starting that sentence this way. I was in a conversation with a religious person recently. The thing is that I've got all these religious people who are coming at me, because of my position as an atheist activist. Each one of them believes they have the golden ticket, right? They're going to rescue me. They're going to give me enlightenment and introduce me to Jesus or Allah, whoever. But one thing I hear often, I heard it again just a few weeks ago, is that more and more people are running to God. There's a sweep of evangelism on this planet. It is obviously the end times. People are running to receive salvation and prepare their souls for eternity. And the data on that says what?
Wow. Where do you live again, Seth?
I live in Oak Oklahoma.
Oh, Oklahoma. That's why you're hearing that.
It's Jesus Town. I live in Jesus Town, USA. I am 20 minutes from Oral Roberts University. I'm 15 minutes from Rhema Bible Training Center. There's 300 and some churches just in the city limits in this town. Okay. So, yeah, welcome to my nightmare. All right.
I was going to say, that's probably why you're hearing that, because the data don't support that. And again, we're going to go nuance here. Your listeners are going to get a fair bit of nuance. The general trend in the developed world is the decline of religiosity. We call this secularization. Basically, what it means is the influence of religion in society is weakening. There's a differentiation, so religion controls less and less of our lives, and people are becoming less and less religious. The data on that, Western Europe is already largely secularized. Like 5% of people go to church on any given Sunday, less in some countries, 7% in a few others. But in the US, we're seeing the exact same trend right now. We're just a little bit behind the times, right? And one thing that I do like to point out, current data in the US suggests that 1 in 5 people, just 20% of Americans, are going to church on any given Sunday. That does not sound to me like a particularly religious country. When 4 out of 5 Americans are doing something else on Sundays or Saturdays, whatever your holy day is, we're not a particularly religious country. That's actually a fairly secular country. And the numbers are going in the direction that, both of us kind of would hope for, which is that religion's declining. In 1990, just 7% of Americans said that they had no religious affiliation. By 2001, it had doubled to 14%. And as of 2012, we're still getting our data on 2014, we're now hovering between 20 and 21%. In one report that I wrote, we estimated between 1990 and 2001, 600,000 Americans left religions every single year. We're winning. We're winning. There's just no way to see that in any other way. Now, here comes the nuance. And this is a little, kind of a downer for your listeners. In the developed world, there's no question secularization is happening, and the U.S. is actually at the we're behind the times in terms of how secularized we are. In the less developed world, particularly in predominantly Muslim countries, and I think there are some even more nuance that maybe I'll get to, but what's happening in predominantly Muslim countries and other less developed countries is they're out reproducing us. They're having more kids. And as a result, what is actually happening is that they're growing. So there is now a little bit of evidence to suggest that the future, and we don't know how far, it's hard to project into the future is going to actually see, as a percentage of the world population, the 7+ billion people who are on the planet, the percentage who are non-religious is probably going to go down a little bit in the immediate future because the religious are out reproducing us. And I'm not necessarily saying go have babies. Go have sex. That's totally cool. But don't necessarily go have babies. I'm totally cool with the sex part. But there is, in kind of the global perspective, there is reason to believe that in the immediate future, the religious are going to continue to out reproduce us. And as a result, there's going to be an increase. But it's not necessarily of Christians, right? It's actually mostly of Muslims. Some Christians as well. In the global South, less developed countries that are predominantly Christian, Pentecostalism is still doing well. And they're still having more kids. But it's mostly predominantly Muslim countries where they're having quite a few kids and they're out reproducing us. And as a result, that's probably what's going to happen. So there's a positive and a negative. In the US, religion is declining, and it's probably going to continue that way. I would be surprised if there's a big reversal. There is no revival, right? I have a fun anecdote there. I saw mentioned in my local paper here in Tampa, this is a few years ago, they talked about this major revival that 9 churches in the area were involved in. They were trying to get everybody to come and join, the church and get baptized. And after a year of revival efforts, they had a quote unquote mass baptism in Tampa Bay. They baptized 24 people.
At a mass event. That's awesome.
It was a year of work, and they got 24 people. And I laughed so hard that I couldn't believe it. And actually, I wrote into the paper and said, that doesn't seem like a mass baptism thing. And they actually changed it. They took out mass baptism and said they had a baptism in the Bay.
Hey, Ryan,
yeah.
was this whole procreation thing a deal with the Mormons? I mean, was it, we are going to procreate our way into retaking the planet? Was that ever kind of a teaching of theirs?
Not so much that they were going to take over the planet.
Well, you know what I mean. I mean,
Sure.
I'm not talking
Yeah.
about, you know, the
Absolutely.
world of worlds, but I mean, we're going to go out and I'm trying to think of the terminology we used in the church. You know, we will be a stronger force if there are more soldiers in our army, kind of a thing, I guess is
Yeah.
accurate.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a little bit of that. They actually have a slightly different theological justification for their higher rates of reproduction in the LDS Church, and it's weird, right? And I can go into it. Hopefully, I can do it quick. But basically, they believe in a pre-existence in addition to a post-existence, right? So an afterlife. They believe that all of us are God's children. Literally, we are spiritual offspring of God and His wife or wives, and children who are born to Mormons in good Mormon families, they get all of the benefits of being raised in a Mormon family. So it's not so much that they're trying to just out-reproduce everybody because they're going to take over the world that way. They actually believe that there are benefits to having kids because there's a finite number of God's spiritual children who have to be born on the planet. All of them have to have a chance to come here. And then when that's done, then Jesus is going to come again. Right? So that's the second coming. So we're waiting for all of God's children to get a mortal body. And the more of God's children that can be brought into Mormon families, the better, because they start with that advantage in life. They start being, quote unquote, born under the covenant, meaning they're sealed to their parents and they have certain advantages. It's kind of a superiority thing. So they do still on average have about one kid more than the average person in the US. But it's actually based on that justification, which is a little weird, right? That they want to bring those kids into those families, not necessarily take over the world.
One more question very quickly
Sure.
on the subject of the decline of religion. The difference between an atheist and non-religious. I mean, if a study says that someone is less religious or not religious, this does not automatically mean they are a non-believer in deities. I mean, do you want to help us sort of navigate this?
Absolutely. And I think that's another point where nuance is absolutely necessary. So, and I hear this occasionally in the atheist free thought community. There'll be things like, 20% of Americans are atheists. No, 20% of Americans are non-religious. What we mean by that is in surveys, when we do our big national level surveys or whatever, we ask people. That's really the only way that we can capture what your religious affiliation is. We just ask you. So we'll say things like, what is your religion, if any? And then we go off of whatever their response is. So when people say, well, I'm not religious, all that means in our minds is that they don't identify as being part of any of the established religions. That doesn't tell us anything about their belief in God. And that's actually a really important point to note because religion is multidimensional. There are multiple ways to be religious, right? Like you can go, but you can also believe and you can also tithe, right? That's like belief, behavior, and belonging. You can identify as well. So you could score really low in terms of identification by saying I'm not religious, but you could still believe in God. And it turns out a certain percentage actually do. It's about 27% of the non-religious. So you ask, what is your religion, if any? They say, I'm not religious. And then if you ask later in the same survey, regarding your belief in God, do you believe, there is no God? I'm not sure. I believe in a higher power. I doubt sometimes. Or I'm confident God exists. About 27% of Americans say, yeah, I'm not religious, but I'm confident that there's a God. So it's like 1 in 4 of the non-religious are actually theists, right? About half are some form of atheist or agnostic, right? So they're like, I don't believe, or I'm not sure, or I believe sometimes, but I have my doubts. And then the remaining fourth are basically deists. They believe in a higher power, something like that. So those are two different measures. They don't mean the same thing. And we actually track both, right? Because they're meaningful in different ways. And there are all sorts of really fun things when you start disentangling those. Turns out just slightly less than half of the people who don't believe in God in the US are actually affiliated with churches, which I think is fascinating. Right?
So it's a cultural thing. It's or perhaps it's one of those deals where you have the luxury of just sort of invoking God at the dinner table at the prayer, but it doesn't really have any impact on your life. You have the luxury of sort of falling into the religion column, but you don't have to do anything really religious in order to qualify. Is that perhaps part of it?
Yeah. So, I mean, they're just distinct dimensions of being, right? And so you can be, 1% of the atheists are in church every Sunday. I mean, it's like, that's interesting, right? Why? Well, many of them are probably married to theists and they're trying to maintain marital harmony. Like that makes sense. I'm okay with that. That I get it. They're just not the same thing. So don't be telling people that 20% of Americans are atheists. No, the number hovers between like 3 and 7%. We're not exactly sure. Different surveys have found different things, but it's probably between 3 and 7% are atheists. 20 to 22% are non-religious. Not the same thing.
The book is a tremendous resource for those of us in the arena of discussion and debate. And it's not often that I say to our listeners, go support this book and just pour through it. But I really think our listeners really should. I like the way the information's laid out. It relates so much to the discussions that we have all the time. It helps us to sort of debunk the bunk. And I just thought it was interesting stuff. It's called What You Don't Know About Religion But Should. I will include the link in the description box of this show. Dr. Ryan Cragun, you are a great guest and a lot of fun to talk to. Thanks for chewing into your schedule to be a part of the broadcast today.
Thank you so much, Seth. This was delightful.
Next Tuesday, we talk about the question of Christ with Dr. Richard Carrier, David Fitzgerald, and Dr. Robert M. Price. Hope you can join us for that. Thanks again to tonight's show sponsor. It's NatureBox, where you can get your free trial sampler right now by going to naturebox.com/thinkingatheist. Snack smarter with NatureBox. naturebox.com/thinkingatheist. And I'll see you next week.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter. Watch dozens of original videos on the Thinking Atheist YouTube channel. And visit our website for resources, links, contact information, the editor's blog, and more. thethinkingatheist.com.